The Honourable David Parker.
Mr Chairman, I want an assurance from the Minister and the Chair that Part 2 is not going to affect a change to the principle that the fund should pay tax. It should pay tax like any other investor, despite the fact that it is government-owned. That is the underlying principle that we currently have, and that is the principle that should continue. Now, we from time to time hear claims, and I've even heard people who are very close to the super fund questioning whether they should pay tax. The reason that they should pay tax, Mr Chairman, is that otherwise they will be advantaged relative to other investors in the New Zealand market, and they would also be encouraged to weight their investments to investments in New Zealand, where they would have a tax advantage on those investments investing in New Zealand, because they wouldn't have to pay tax on those investments compared with investing overseas. And that would cause them to weight their investments more into New Zealand than overseas for the wrong reasons. So, Mr Chairman, I want to have an assurance from the Minister in the House and the Minister and the Chair that these amendments to the Income Tax Act 2007, they're made by Clause 10 of this bill and to Section CW 38 and CX 55, that these changes do not affect the current status quo, which is that the super fund should pay tax as other taxpayers does. Now, for some people that is counterintuitive, because it's the government, it's a government entity paying tax, which decreases the amount that is left in the super fund for the meeting of future superannuation, and more going into Crown coffers because it's paying tax. But nonetheless, I think that is an important point in principle that was imposed in the original design of the Act. And as we know, the Labour Party and Michael Cullen had more foresight. Dr. Cullen was preparing the super fund for privatisation. Really? Oh, look! I've heard some brain-dead comments from the opposition on occasions, but really, that takes the cake. You should be brought forward to the front bench. You'd be very comfortable in the National Party there. Of course. You know, this fund was created by the Labour Party, opposed by National Party. So how that member could say that this was preparing it for privatisation? Fact is stranger than fiction sometimes, isn't it, Mr Chairman? No, that's not correct. Indeed, that gives me licence, I think, Mr Chairman, responding to that interjection from the opposition, to recount the fact ad nauseum, really, that we've heard before, that we should take care in respect to the super fund that we actually don't cause it to aid the privatisation agenda of any government. And indeed, the super fund, because some of New Zealand's largest listed entities now include energy companies, one of the things that has happened through the super fund since the government privatised those entities is that we have caused to go from the government balance sheet through direct ownership to the superannuation fund investments in privatised assets if the super fund has invested in either Genesis, Mighty River Power or Meridian. And that, of course, was one of the things that Dr. Cullen was trying to guard against when he set up and gave pretty clear directions that he didn't want this fund to be weighted towards investing in New Zealand, because he knew that one way or another there was always a risk that national governments would plunder the fund in order to achieve their other objectives. Now, we hear Chris Bishop laughing about that. But if there was a subscription by the super fund in those privatised companies, it will have increased demand for those shares, and therefore will have had some effect on the price that was able to be achieved on the sale of those shares. Now, it may well be that they didn't invest in those shares, in which case that wouldn't have happened, but if they did, it must have had an effect on demand and therefore an effect on price. And as Mr Chairman,
the Honourable David Parker.
And as Mr Bailey has already said, this is already the largest investor in New Zealand. It's far bigger than any KiwiSaver fund, it's far bigger than any private superannuation fund, it's far bigger than any other investment fund of the government, including the ACC fund. It is the largest investor in New Zealand. Therefore, it does have the ability to, because of that size, to influence price. So, I invite the member who interjected opposite to hang and head his shame and resolve from those rather silly comments that he made at the start.
He was more our side than your side.
Say that again, clearly.
You need to put a filter in there. Dr. Cullen was the one who said don't borrow to invest money in the super fund.
No, he didn't say that. No, Dr Cullen didn't say that. No, Dr Cullen indeed thought that contributions to the super fund should continue. In fact, again, he's a very poor student of history, this particular member, and I was here after the global financial crisis hit, after we lost government. So was Dr Cullen. so that member wasn't, and you will recall that we were critical of the government for making that short-sighted decision. And it's actually, I think it's actually testament to the independence of the Guardians that despite the embarrassment to the government caused by the Guardians measuring the loss that the government has caused to the super fund by ceasing contributions, that the Guardians have continued to calculate what would have been in the fund had those contributions continued, which brings me to also an inane contribution from one of your colleagues who said it was always stupid to borrow to invest. Well, that's true if you're capital constrained, but the current government hasn't been capital constrained because they inherited very low levels of government debt, zero net debt, and gross debt having been reduced from 38 to 18% of GDP. Now, the member said that you can never beat borrowing rates, it would be silly. Well, of course, the government stock rate is generally the lowest long-term rate to invest in, and you get higher rates of return if you invest in security or balanced portfolio of bonds, as Mr Bailey knows well. So it should be no surprise to members on the other side that if they had borrowed, they would have achieved a rate of return actually, you know, the trouble with these guys is they've got no foresight. I mean, it would be nice if occasionally they got one of these decisions in advance right. You know, we're not saying that you should judge everything by hindsight, but it would be good if occasionally they got one right with foresight. They called it a dog. They were wrong. They now admit they were wrong. They stopped investments when they shouldn't have stopped them, but they can't bring themselves to admit that even though it was always obvious that the investment rate over the medium term exceeds the Crown cost of funds, they haven't been able to acknowledge that that was a stupid decision too.
Thank you very much.